Thanks for joining us on What Matters This Week. I'm Lauren Maloney. Matthew Carlson is here. He's a U of M professor and teaches classes on comparative politics and the politics of China, Japan, and East Asia. Sir, I appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to talk all things Beijing and the Olympics just because there's such a lot to talk about when we talk about politics in general and what's going on in the world right now. There seems to be a dark shadow over the games, over these geopolitical tensions. Can you help us explain a little bit what the situation is here?
Sure. I think with every Olympics, there's often political disputes. Countries use the Olympics to get leverage over other countries. At the same time, the media spotlights things that it finds questionable. And so both countries use the games to be political. The media also makes things very political. So I think what we're seeing with the Beijing Winter Olympics is pretty much what we see with every Olympics.
As far as the human rights violations, it seems like though this is kind of a different situation here with the controversy.
Maybe, but of course, in 2008, they called the Beijing Olympics the Genocide Olympics, which is the same label they're using for the Winter Olympics. Mm-hmm. Certainly the situation with Hong Kong, that might be newer, but at least things with human rights with the Muslims in Xinjiang, that's been going on for 2 decades. So the way that the Chinese government and the American government views human rights, that's been a sticking point for at least most of the Cold War. So I don't know that anything is new here, but some of the stories the media is referencing, they do seem concerning. But again, the Olympics is politicized.
There's a diplomatic boycott, of course. The United States didn't send, like the First Lady or anyone, within the cabinet. I've heard a lot of people ask, how much good does this boycott do? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I don't think the boycott does a whole lot. The last Olympics in Tokyo, Joe Biden attended. Mm-hmm. Certainly the athletes appreciated that. But by not sending her or any other officials to this games, basically it deprives the US government of a chance to say, hey, we have some concerns. So not sending officials, I think, was a lost opportunity.
Does the International Olympic Committee deserve some kind of criticism here too, when it comes to addressing the controversies or maybe allowing the Olympics to be back in Beijing to begin with?
Yeah, the IOC deserves a lot of the blame, a lot of the responsibility. It's a really elitist group. It's very hard to reform. They don't take criticism well. Of course, with this Winter Olympics, there were only 2 candidates that applied, Beijing, but also a city in Kazakhstan. And so they had to decide, which do we go with? Both are authoritarian governments. Beijing at least had done the Olympics in 2008. So I think probably they made the best choice out of kind of a difficult set of countries. But you need to have countries willing to host the Olympics to have some choice. They only had a choice of 2.
There is so much going on in the world right now, especially with Russia, with the tensions in Ukraine. But of course, during the Olympic ceremonies, we had President Xi seen with Russian President Vladimir Putin. I think one calls the other his best friend. What was that about? And what kind of message did that send to Ukraine, the rest of the world, and America?
I think it wasn't surprising that they found each other and that they came out with a statement to warn other countries to not expand NATO in Europe. So it was unfortunate that they politicized the games in that respect. Hopefully, Russia does not invade Ukraine during the period that the Olympics are going on, and I hope that they don't invade after. But it brings a point back that the games are so politicized, even though the IOC says, they shouldn't be, but the reality is that they are.
Athletes and journalists, Professor, were told to bring a burner phone, and is that because of possible surveillance? Right? I mean, there was a lot of concerns with, even athletes and journalists at this games deciding, voluntarily deciding to go.
Yeah, I mean, China's they're trying to push the zero COVID policy. Everything's very controlled. So they wanted athletes to install apps on their phone. But at least it's likely that they had some software that if activated, they could listen. They could be notified of inappropriate conversations. So the suggestion to bring a burner phone was probably a practical suggestion. But I think because of the COVID restrictions, the athletes are getting a little bit of a taste like what it's like to be living in China right now.
I was going to push you a little bit further on that. Is it a scary situation for Americans, for our athletes, for our journalists to be in Beijing right now?
I don't think it's scary. I think during the Olympics, China will be on its best behavior. And it's really not China's Olympics, it's the World Olympics. Yeah. The IOC is sponsoring it with Beijing. So I think they're on their best behavior. They need to show to the world that China can do this, and they can do it during the Omicron surge. And so some athletes might complain a little bit about things they don't like, but I don't think they're in a necessarily scary environment. They're in a very protective bubble.
Right. You had mentioned the COVID bubble. I think it's so interesting. You were actually at the Tokyo Games just, 6 or 7 months ago yourself volunteering. What was that bubble like? I mean, what are these athletes encountering when they land, and basically we know they have to test every day?
I mean, I thought it was difficult with the Tokyo bubble, but I could leave, I could go out of the venue, I could take part in society. So I think the conditions in the Chinese bubble are much more severe. On top of that, maybe there's more athlete complaints about things like the food, having to quarantine. So not only is it maybe more severe, but there's less freedoms. And if you're a journalist, I mean, pretty much everyone that's involved, they're confined to that bubble. So I think it's much more challenging than it was with the Tokyo Olympics.
What did you take away, though, after you came home and basically took part in a games under really unprecedented circumstances?
No, I wanted to sign up again. So I have to look forward to Paris 2024. So I'm willing to do it again, and hopefully there won't be a COVID bubble.
I did want to ask about the climate right now in Beijing and climate change in general. I mean, we've seen some kind of really interesting photos, maybe jarring photos of this ski jump, and then a nuclear power plant in the background. I mean, and we've heard, this is all man-made snow. So as far as athletes too entering winter games, this is kind of different territory in a way, isn't it?
So they took an old energy plant and they used that to host part of the games. So, it's kind of a cool background. They're not really nuclear plants, so maybe it's less scary, but those were old generators that used to pollute the skyline, that they've converted into a park where people can go and enjoy the winter sports after the Olympics is done. So, I mean, I applaud them for making a creative use of that old industrial area. The artificial snow, I mean, certainly 30 years from now, I don't know that Beijing could host the Winter Olympics because the change in the climate. So 100% of their snow right now is artificial. I don't think that's surprising. Most Winter Olympics use artificial snow. If you ski in Vermont, you know that the ski resorts here use artificial snow. It's just water and ice. They have to freeze the ground in Beijing, but I don't think it's. I think it's just, if you want to ski in Beijing, you have to create some snow, and that's what they're doing. They don't add chemicals to it, so.
Yeah, we are certainly getting a look at the infrastructure, that's for sure, on a lot of these wide shots, in the energy plant that you mentioned. Matthew Carlson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.